Throughout Scripture, we see the verb to worship, sometimes to bow down, to fall prostrate. Have you ever wondered about what this means? Today we're going to take a look. Shalom, welcome to Rob on the Rock. I'm Rob Van Hoff, and today we're going to look at the verb to worship, the Hebrew and Greek verbs behind that verb to worship. Sometimes you'll see to bow down on the ground before, or to fall prostrate. There are different ways that this phrase has been translated. The translations we'll look at today are from the NASB. What we'll see here is just my simple gloss, to worship. And the Hebrew infinitive is hishtachavot. Hishtachavot. And it's what we call a hishtafal, which means it's a pretty rare verbal paradigm. But nevertheless, hishtachavot, to bow down, to worship. And it's translated in the ancient Greek with this same verb that we see used in the Apostolic Writings, proskunein or proskuneo, I bow down, I worship. And there's some thought that the root of the Greek word kuneo or kunein here is associated with another Greek word kuso, which might be where we get the word kiss. But kuneo certainly does mean kiss anyway in Greek. Whether or not it's related to our English word kiss is for someone else to decide here. But what we're going to do, we're going to look first through the Torah. Again, these are the NASB translations of hishtachavot, where the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew uses proskunein. It uses the same verb. Then we're going to look at a handful of passages from the Greek New Testament, the Apostolic Writings, where proskunein is continued to be used. And we're going to then be able to differentiate some nuance between usages. And in the end, what we're going to see is that context is king. We always have to look at context, and that'll become super clear by the end of our study today. So first, we're just going to zero in on the Torah, and there's several passages in Genesis itself where hishtachavot has a fluidity or a wide range of meanings. It's not always Adonai or the Lord who is the recipient of the worship, as we'll see. So just in the Torah itself, we see that the verb, the hishtachavot, could be used in different contexts. So here we go. We'll do this, and I hope this study will be helpful for you. The first passage we'll look at is its first occurrence in the Torah, Genesis 18. And of course, this is when the three visitors come to see Abraham. It says, he, that is Abraham, lifted up his eyes and looked. Behold, three men were standing opposite him. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth. And this is that verb, the hishtachavot. He bowed himself to the earth. Now, again, just this act alone is describing a physical act. It's describing a position of the physical body. That's all it is. It doesn't necessarily, as we'll see by the end of our study, reflect the proper intent of the heart. We'll see this as we go. Again, in 22:5, this again is Abraham talking to the young men when he and Isaac are going to go up the hill to worship, the famous passage called the Akedah. It says, Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad, that is Isaac, will go over there, and we will worship, and we will return to you. So here, neshtachave, we will worship, or we will bow down. Same verb used in chapter 18 as we saw, but here, because they're taking wood and a knife, the plan is that there's going to be sacrifice, which is worship of God, of course. But then in 23:12, when Abraham is negotiating to purchase a land in which to bury Sarah, who has passed away, it says Abraham bowed before the people of the land. It's hishtachaveh, or hishtachavot in the infinitive. Now, he's not worshiping them, so you can see how the NASB translates it, we will worship, in 22:5, but here, bowed before. So the context is determining the NASB translator's decision, even though the Hebrew word's the same. Let's continue on in Genesis. In 24:52, this is Abraham's servant going to find a wife for Isaac. Abraham's servant heard their words. He bowed himself to the ground before the Lord. Well, Abraham's servant is in a foreign country right now, going on commandment or on charge from Abraham to find a wife from the family of Laban, and ultimately will bring back, of course, Rebecca for Isaac. But here we know that Abraham's servant prays to the Lord, and here in this specific passage, he's bowing himself down to the Lord, even though he's in the land of foreign people. Genesis 33:3. Now this is this is Jacob rather, being reunited with Esau. And it says he himself, that is Jacob, passed on ahead of them and bowed down to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother, that is to Esau. So bowed down, again, not translated worship here, but just bowed down, although it's the same verb. Another one in Genesis is Joseph relating his dream of the sheaves to his brothers in Genesis 37. And he's telling them, for behold, we were all binding sheaves in the field, Joseph tells his brothers, and lo, my sheaf rose up and also stood erect. And behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf. And again, so the bowed down here is from the same Hebrew verb, the hishtachavot, bowed down. So is Joseph claiming deity here, or is it a submission to hierarchy, submission to someone in a position of physically expressing humility and dependence to someone else? Then we have clearly, but we'll look at one passage from Numbers and one at Deuteronomy. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but this just gives us an example. Numbers 25:2, this is the daughters of Moab, they invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. Again, same verb, the hishtachavot. Interesting that in Genesis 22, NASB would translate it as worship, but in Numbers 25, they didn't say worship. Again, the Hebrew is the same verb. So it could be that it was a different team working on Numbers than worked on Genesis, and they didn't try to fine-tune that or be consistent. But it's the same verb, worship. Deuteronomy 4:19, beware not to lift up your eyes to heaven and see the sun and the moon and the stars and all the host of heaven, and be drawn away and worship them and serve them. So here, and worship them. Here, the NASB goes back to the same plan it had with Genesis 22, hishtachavot, to translate that as to worship. So again, we're seeing a variance in translation, which I don't have a problem with, but because we can see that context matters here. But I would be a little critical of the NASB here, say, why not worship here in Numbers 25 too, but you're going to have it in 4:19 of Deuteronomy. So just a little quibble, not a big deal. In any case, you can look throughout the rest of Tanakh, just do a word search on hishtachaveh or hishtachavot, and you will find all the occurrences of this. We're kind of doing a shorthand, quick word study here. Now we're going to transition and look at the Apostolic Writings. But what we've seen so far is the same word in different contexts give us different meanings. So let's continue here. Again, I just reiterate our words. To worship, Hebrew hishtachavot, and Greek proskunein, or proskuneo in the first person singular in the present tense, which is your traditional Greek lexicon. But I have the infinitive here, to bow down or to worship. And we're going to look at a few from the Gospel of Matthew first. Matthew 2:11 is talking about the wise men who've come, the magi who've come from the east. And it says, after coming into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother. They fell to the ground and worshiped him. So they have the object here of the worship. They worshiped him. And this is the same concept, proskunein, which is the same concept as hishtachavot in Hebrew. Then, opening their treasures, they presented to him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So here we have the infant baby Yeshua being worshipped by foreign kings. Matthew 4:9. Now look at this. This is Yeshua being tempted in the wilderness after his immersion in the Jordan River with John. The devil says to him, "All these things I will give you if you fall down and worship me." Again, this is proskunein, hishtachavot, same concept. But Jesus said to him, "Go, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God and serve him only." So again, Yeshua cites the passage from Deuteronomy, "You shall worship the Lord your God," just with the same Greek and Hebrew, hishtachavot and proskunein. Same concept here. So here, Yeshua refuses to do this physical act of a bodily expression of humility by bowing down, falling prostrate to the earth, to communicate humility and obedience and dependence upon an authority, figure of honor. Continuing on, Matthew 18:26. Now there's a whole parable here, but this is a one where the slave is going to be put in prison, basically, and he goes to his master. It says the slave fell to the ground and prostrated himself before him, saying to his master, "Have patience with me, and I will repay you everything." And if you remember this parable, go back and read it in Matthew 18. The master then forgives the debt, but then this same slave goes to someone who owes him and puts him in prison. And then when the master hears of this, he comes back to this guy here, this slave, and says, "You're wicked." And you can read about the consequences. It doesn't go well for this guy. But what we see here in Matthew is that this is an instance of hypocrisy. So this slave fell to the ground and prostrated himself before him. And that's proskuneo or proskunein. "Have patience with me, I will repay you everything." But he goes and he will not be the same way to another person. So this prostration is worthless. So what it shows is that someone can be externally, quote, showing an attitude of worship, but internally their hearts are far. And we know that from what Isaiah wrote. These people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. So hypocritical worship, quote unquote, was not new in the first century, of course, but Yeshua is highlighting it as a severe, serious problem. After the resurrection, we see in Matthew 28:9, "And behold, Jesus met them and greeted them, and they came up and took hold of his feet and worshipped him." Again, same passage, same verb being used here. Yeshua never refused worship. Let's look again here. Mark 15. This is Yeshua before his crucifixion, but during his trial and being mocked and beaten. It says these are the Roman cohort there, dressed him up in purple. After twisting a crown of thorns, they put it on him, and they began to acclaim him, "Hail, King of the Jews." So this is mocking worship. They kept beating his head with a reed and spitting on him, and kneeling and bowing before him. So again, bowing before him, it's the same concept. Proskunein, or the hishtachavot. They are bowing down. It's a physical, something they're physically doing with their body. But of course, we know by the context that this is mocking. They are mocking him. They are laughing and making fun. There's no attitude at all in their heart of genuine humility here. And that's evident, not from the use of the verb itself, kneeling and bowing down before him. If that's all we saw, we wouldn't know. But since we know the whole context, we realize this is external displays of worship that are meant not even to deceive anybody. With the hypocrite wants people to believe that his worship or her worship is true and genuine, even though they know it's not. That's the hypocrite. Here, they are doing it externally with the signal also that what they are doing is mocking. And it's particularly brutal. So this is not hypocritical worship. This is brutal mocking worship. So people who see this are supposed to know that it's not real. Different from hypocrisy. Then we can look at a few instances where we see hishtachavot or proskunein, to bow down, to worship, in a context where the attitude is correct, the attitude of the heart is correct, but the external act is misdirected. And we'll see this in two places. One in Acts, written for us by the Apostle Luke, and then again in the book of Revelation, written by John. So when Peter entered, Cornelius met him and fell at his feet and worshiped him. Again, same word. So Cornelius falls down and worships Peter. But Peter raised him up, saying, "Stand up, I too am just a man." So here, Peter doesn't say that Cornelius' heart attitude of humility and dependence upon God is wrong. Not at all. It's just that what Peter wants to gently do is to say, not towards me, towards God. Okay? So keep your heart attitude, but you need corrected knowledge in terms of expressing that attitude of worship towards God. Again, in Revelation, maybe you'll remember this, Revelation 22, I, John, am the one who heard and saw these things. And when I heard and saw, I fell down to worship at the feet of the angel who showed me these things. But he said to me, "Do not do that. I'm a fellow servant of yours and of your brethren the prophets and of those who heed the words of this book. Worship God." So even John, who knew Yeshua in the flesh and the resurrected Yeshua, still, just like Cornelius, who was a newbie, right? John, who was a seasoned believer, who had physically spent time with Yeshua in the flesh or in his ministry, was there during the trial and execution, rejoiced to see Yeshua resurrected, spent time with him post-resurrection, etc., and had served the remaining decades of his life. And here we see his need to receive this check, right? And it doesn't matter where you are on your path with the Lord, we always can learn more wisdom. There's always more accurate understanding that we grow into. Finally, we're going to look at the Gospel of John. And in the Gospel of John, chapter 4, we read about Yeshua being up in Samaria. And he's speaking with a woman there at the well, of Jacob's well. And she asks about, we worship here. And same verb, proskunein, the hishtachavot, same concept. And the idea is we worship God on this mountain. You Jews worship God in Jerusalem. And, what is it? What do we do? So the context is worshiping God. But Yeshua brings up the concept of true worship. Yeshua understands that there are external worship without knowledge, without right knowledge, or hypocritical worship. And what Yeshua adds a modifier, true worship. Same thing we see with God, the true God, right? Because anybody can say God this, God that, but the true God. And the claim then is we as believers understand who the true God is. We have the scriptures that testify to who the true God is. In the same way, Yeshua brings clarification and instruction to a Samaritan woman here about true worship. But an hour is coming and now is when the true worshipers, from the same verb, proskunein, will worship. Again, the same verb, proskunein. The true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people the Father seeks to be his worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. So what we see here is a cluster, and if I just chose these two verses, but if you look at the larger passage of John 4, you'll see worship mentioned more than just this dense cluster here of the worship. That's the verb. Worshippers, true worshippers, to worship the Father. Here, the heart issue is what matters. So we saw, like with Acts, Cornelius, or in Revelation, where John himself bows down to worship and then needs this correction. So your heart attitude is not wrong. We need to give you more information, more clarity, so you have an accurate understanding. That's different than the worship of the soldiers who are mocking Yeshua. Everybody who sees it knows that they don't mean it. And it's part of the play acting that they're doing. So that's to be differentiated. So obviously that's not true worship, although the physical motion is the same. That's why the same verb is used. The hypocrite is different. The hypocrite is the person who worships externally, acting, but the desire is for people to believe it's sincere. The desire is to appear to be pious, to appear to love God. Although inside they know, the hypocrite knows that their heart is somewhere else. So those are all to be differentiated. And yet we saw also in the Torah itself where Abraham can bow down before the people of the land. It doesn't mean he's worshiping them as if they were deity. It has to do with him showing that ancient Near Eastern context of absolute dependence and humility before them. It's a sign of honor and respect. And he has a deep, deep desire to bury Sarah in the cave of Machpelah. But he's also acknowledging that this is this is under a different people's power. It's not under his local power. Although God has already promised him this land, Abraham is not taking that lead. He doesn't go in there and say, this is my land. And so there's this nature of communication between different peoples. And the idea is in that culture to show oneself open and vulnerable in hope of building good relations, of not having any ulterior motive. Again, in every case, it's an action. It's a physical action of placing the body on the ground before another. Now we saw with Abraham's servant, before the Lord, was the Lord physically there? Well, in his heart, he had sanctified the Lord in his heart. And so in his physical bowing down, his heart is focused on the Lord. And that is proper worship. That is worship of the Lord in spirit and in truth. So thanks again to the one who sent in this question about this verb proskuneo and hishtachavot. These verses give us a real nice picture of the variety of its usage. And we remember that words don't have meaning. Meaning has words. That means the context is always our primary framework from which we are able to understand the nuance of the meaning of the given word in this or that passage. So let this be just a mini word study, and by all means, you can go and study all the many, many more times that proskunein or the hishtachavot are used in the Tanakh or in the Apostolic Writings. Shalom.